The question of colonies occupied a central and evolving position in the development of classical and early modern political economy. From Adam Smith in the late 18th century to Karl Marx in the 19th century, economic thinkers didn't treat colonialism as a peripheral issue but a structural component of commercial society, capital accumulation, and global power. Yet their interpretations diverged sharply. What begins in Adam Smith as a critique of mercantilist empire becomes in David Ricardo an analytical concern about capital allocation and profitability. In Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a blueprint for systematic capitalist reproduction abroad. In John Stuart Mill's, a qualified defense of colonization under utilitarian and civilizational principles. And in Karl Marx, a structural condemnation of colonialism as an instrument of capitalist expansion and primitive accumulation. Together, these thinkers chart a transformation in economic thought, from liberal skepticism towards empire of technocratic justification and ultimately to revolutionary critique. Adam Smith's writing in 1776 in Book 4, Chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations approached colonies primarily as a problem within the mercantile system. For Smith, the European colonial project was not a natural existence of commerce but an artificial construct built upon monopoly, restriction, and illusion. He distinguishes ancient Greek colonies, self-governing and economically independent, from modern European colonies who were subordinated to the commercial interests of the mother country. The mercantilists believed that national wealth consisted in the accumulation of gold and silver, led European powers to view colonies as instruments for exclusive trade and bullion extraction. Smith rejected this logic at the foundation. Wealth in his analysis derived from productive labor and division of labor, not from hoarding of precious metals. The monopoly of colonial trade enforced through navigation acts, exclusive charters and distorted markets raised domestic price and enriched a narrow class of merchants at the expense of the general public. Colonial wars, in Smith's view, were not rational economic ventures but costly struggles driven by pride and private interests. He argued that the cost of defending and administering colonies frequently exceeded any real benefit to the mother country. Indeed, he suggested that Britain would be better served by granting independence to its American colonies and maintaining free trade relations, predicting that peaceful separation would restore natural affection and mutual benefit. Smith's critique thus emerges as a liberal indictment of mercantilist empire. Colonies were economically irrational, politically burdensome, and sustained by false theories of wealth. David Ricardo, writing several decades later in Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, didn't devote a separate systematic chapter to colonies in the way Smith did, but his analytical framework has profound implications for understanding imperial expansion. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage undermined the mercantilist logic that justified colonial monopolies. If nations specialize according to relative efficiency, then mutual benefit trade can occur without political domination. Colonies are unnecessary for securing markets. Voluntary exchange suffices. Ricardo's theory of rent and diminishing returns also reframes the question of territorial expansion. As cultivation extends to less fertile land, rent arises on superior lands, and profits tend to fall as wages rise with increasing population. Colonies could temporarily relieve this pressure by opening access to more fertile or cheaper land, thereby slowing the fall in profits and providing outlets for capital. Yet for Ricardo, this was not a moral justification of empire, but a structural economic mechanism. The migration of capital and labor abroad could restore profitability without fundamentally altering the laws of governing distribution between wages, profits, and rent. Ricardo's perspective remains largely analytical and abstract. He does not romanticize colonization, nor does he endorse monopoly. Instead, he situates colonial expansion within the broader patterns of capital mobility and the search for higher returns. Colonies become, in Ricardian terms, extension of the global market rather than trophies of national prestige. Edward Gibbon Wakefield represents a decisive shift in colonial theory. Writing in the early 19th century, Wakefield observed that colonies such as in North America and Australia, which was also called as Australasia if I'm not wrong, the abundance of land allowed laborers to acquire property easily, thereby escaping wage dependence. This, he argued, undermined the formation of a disciplined labor market and prevented the emergence of a stable capitalist class structure. In his theory of systematic colonization, Wakefield proposed that colonial land should not be distributed freely but sold at a sufficient price to prevent laborers from immediately becoming independent proprietors. The revenue from land sales would fund the margination of additional laborers. Pardon. The revenue from land sales would fund the migration of additional laborers, ensuring a continuous supply of wage labor. In this way, colonial policy would deliberately produce the social relations of capitalism. Wakefield transforms colonization from accidental expansion into calculated social engineering. Unlike Smith, who criticized colonial monopolies as distortions of natural liberty, Wakefield openly embraces intervention. The colony becomes a laboratory for constructing capitalist society under controlled conditions. His theory reflects a growing recognition that capitalism depends not only on free exchange but on structural relations between land, labor, and capital. Colonization in Wakefield's hands is no longer an irrational mercantile dream, but a rational strategy to prevent labor scarcity and preserve class hierarchy. John Stuart Mill, influenced both by classical economics and utilitarian philosophy, offers a more ambivalent stance. In Principles of Political Economy, Mill accepts many Ricardian doctrines regarding distribution and growth, yet he also engages explicitly with colonial questions. Mill acknowledges that mature industrial society may suffer from declining profits due to capital accumulation and profit and population growth. Colonies can serve as outlets for surplus labor and capital, alleviating economic pressure at home. At the same time, Mill introduces a moral dimension absent in Ricardo. He argues that barbarous societies may require tutelage and that imperial governance, if conducted responsibly, can promote civilization and progress. This paternalistic justification reflects 19th century liberal imperialism, the belief that empire can be compatible with liberty if it advances education, law, and infrastructure. Mill doesn't advocate unrestrained exploitation. Rather, he envisions a form of trusteeship in which colonial rule prepares society for eventual self-government. Yet this framework still assumes hierarchical distinctions between advanced and backward people. Colonization is not merely an economic outlet, but a moral project grounded in utilitarian improvement. Mill thus bridged economic liberalism and imperial administration, embedded colonial expansion within a theory of progress and governance. Karl Marx, writing in the mid to late 19th century, reframes the entire discussion. For Marx, colonialization is neither an unfortunate mercantile error nor a benevolent civilizing mission, but an intrinsic component of capitalist development. In Capital and earlier works, Marx describes primitive accumulation as a violent historical process through which producers were separated from the means of production, creating a class of wage laborers. Colonial conquest, slavery, plunder created a central role in this transformation. The expropriation of land in the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade and the extraction of precious metals were not peripheral events but the foundational moments in the rise of European capitalism. Marx acknowledges that colonial expansion can accelerate the global spread of capitalist relations, dissolving pre-capitalist structures and integrating distant regions into the world market. Yet this integration is marked by exploitation and unequal exchange. Colonies provide raw materials, cheap labor, and markets for manufactured goods, reinforcing the dominance of industrial capital in the metropole. Unlike Smith, who hoped that free trade could dissolve imperial tensions, Marx sees global capitalism itself as the driver of imperial expansion. Colonialization is the outward movement of capital in search of new arenas for accumulation, a process that will intensify as domestic markets saturate. While Marx sometimes recognized the contradictory effects of colonialism, destroying feudal stagnation while imposing capitalist exploitation, his ultimate judgment is clear: empire is a manifestation of class power on a global scale. Taken together, these thinkers trace a remarkable evolution in economic thought. Smith's critique targets mercantilist monopoly and fiscal burdens. Ricardo abstracts the problem into laws of distribution and comparative advantage. Wakefield systemizes colonization as a tool for managing labor and capital. Mill overlays economic reasoning with civilizational paternalism, and Marx exposes the structural violence underlying capitalist expansion. The system reflects broader historical transformations. In Smith's era, colonialism was closely tied to Booleanism and chartered monopolies. By Ricardo's time, industrial capitalism had matured, and the question became how capital could maintain profitability. Wakefield and Mill write in the age of organized settlement, colonies and high imperialism, when empires required administrative theory. Marx, observing the consolidation of global markets and industrial dominance, identified colonialism as integral to capital's logic of accumulation. The intellectual trajectory also reveals changing concepts of freedom. For Smith, liberty meant the removal of monopoly and restriction. For Ricardo, freedom lay in the operation of comparative advantage and market allocation. Wakefield constrains freedom deliberately to sustain wage labor. Mill tempers freedom with tutelage, allowing imperial rule in the name of progress. Marx redefines freedom as emancipation from wage labor and capitalist exploitation, rendering colonial domination incompatible with genuine human liberation. Colonies therefore become mirrors reflecting each thinker's broader theory of political economy. In conclusion, the debate over colonies among Smith, Ricardo, Wakefield, Mill, and Marx is not merely a historical curiosity but a window into the evolution of economic theory itself. From liberal opposition to mercantile empire, through analytical and administrative rationalization to structural critique of capitalist expansion, their arguments illuminate how economic thought responded to realities of global power. Colonies were not accidental appendages to European development. They were arenas in which theories of trade, capital, labor, and progress was contested, and by tracing these perspectives, one sees how economies of empire moved from skepticism to systemization to denunciation, and reflecting the deepening entanglement between political economy and global domination.